So welcome, everyone. Welcome. We are so thrilled to have each of you with us tonight for a really special presentation. My name is Drew Bush, and I'm the Executive Director at Mount Washington Observatory. And I wanted to let you know how much it means to both our organizations, the Mount Washington Observatory and the Blue Hill Observatory, to have each of you here with us tonight, even as we're, I guess, appropriately waiting for quite a bit of snow to come down on the Super Bowl weekend. We're totally reliant on all of you for your attendance at events like this and for your support to continue all the work that we do. And just really excited to be able to share this experience tonight. Our two organizations, the Blue Hill Observatory and the Mount Washington Observatory, have a long and storied shared history. And we can't thank Blue Hill and its staff, its trustees and volunteers enough for helping us put together this evening. We're also thrilled and grateful that Ty is here to share his risk analysis and outdoor expertise with us tonight. The Mount Washington Observatory has long been a key player with the teams that perform winter search and rescue missions. Our weather information provides the backbone for these operations, and others like those detailed in Ty's books. And we have a real treat for you tonight as well. One of our longest serving observers, Knapp, is here. He's going to introduce Ty's work, talk about his experience. He's been with us for over 20 years. I have just a few small notes for you before I turn things over to my esteemed colleague, Charlie Orloff, the Executive Director at Blue Hill. First off, if you're looking for a copy of Ty's books, I imagine you might have had some trouble. Just a sign of the success of this writing project is that they've been sold out with the publisher for a few weeks now, and we were hoping to have copies here for you tonight as well. The snowstorm last week actually delayed the publisher bringing us a few, but I am happy to be able to tell you that you can pre-order your books out at the front where you saw our table. Ty has graciously agreed to come visit us at our office and to sign them as well. So we'll be happy to mail those to you directly if you pre-order tonight. For those of you who did think ahead and bring your copy of the book already, Ty is also, going to be available to sign books after this presentation as well. So if you give him a chance to make his way out after our Q&A session. And just as you probably know, all of your purchases tonight go to support our two observatories. We really welcome all of the generous support that you've each offered to our work and to enable us to keep doing all that we do. And Ty will share a little bit of information on that at the end of his presentation. And so finally, I would be remiss if I didn't invite you also to join us at Mount Washington. Of course, we love being here with you in Boston, or outside of Boston, I should say. But we would welcome you to tour our Summit Weather Station anytime from May to October, to join one of our winter overnight edu-trips that are in full swing right now, but for next year. And as well to dial in for our Science in the Mountain lecture series, which happens every month with different scientists and different topics. You can find all of the details about us on mountwashington.org under education. And with that, I will turn things over to Charlie.
Good afternoon, everybody. Charlie Orloff here. On November 18, 1932, after a lapse of 40 years and 52 days, formal operations on Mount Washington were finally resumed. Thanks to the initiative of Joseph Dodge of the Appalachian Mountain Club and support of Charles Brooks and his prestigious team at Blue Hill Observatory, they had become the scientific cornerstone of the newly opened Mount Washington Observatory. It was just 7 months later that the stage office observing crew of, I have trouble pronouncing his name, Pagaluka, is that correct? Okay, Mackenzie and Stephenson, plus two very frightened guests, recorded the highest wind ever measured on Earth at that time. As you all know in this room, I'm sure, 231 miles an hour. I should have asked a little quiz. I bet half of the hands would have gone up there. It was only 4 weeks earlier that Sterling Ferguson from Blue Hill Observatory had installed his newly designed heated anemometer just in time for this remarkable event. Our two observatories share a long and rich history, and this year we have been working hard to renew that storied relationship. So on behalf of all of us at Blue Hill Observatory, I'd like to welcome you to this beautiful building owned by MEDITECH, and I would like to thank them for hosting today's event. Blue Hill Observatory and MEDITECH have a long and positive history together. In addition to hosting our Southern New England Weather Conference, for most of the last 20 years, they have always graciously welcomed us for a variety of different events. So I have a question for you. How many of you have been up to Blue Hill Observatory since we were renovated at about, I think it was about $3 million that they put into that building? Well, for the rest of you who haven't had a chance yet, I hope that you'll be able to come up and join us for a tour. We are open every weekend and also every day if you call and make an appointment. We'll make a special effort to be there for you. So it's now great pleasure for me to introduce today's thought-provoking speaker, Ty Gagne.
I'm going to go first, so just bear with me. Cool. Alrighty. Hello, my name is Ryan Knapp. I'm Senior Staff Meteorologist at the Mount Washington Observatory, and as was mentioned earlier, I've been working there for about 20 years. If you're not familiar with the White Mountains, or in particular the Presidential Range, this is a picture of most of the summits within that range. You can tell Mount Washington as the high peak with all the stuff on top of it, that's center frame here. So just to give you a point of reference as to where Mount Washington is and what it looks like. So a bit about me, I'm Senior Staff Meteorologist. I've been working nights most of the time since my beginnings up there. I started back in December of 2005 as an intern, and then quickly thereafter got promoted to being a full-time staff member in February of 2006, and I've been working there ever since. And again, like I was mentioning, I work night shifts up there, which means I'm mainly working alone, but every once in a while the cat comes up and keeps me company. So I graduated with a Bachelor of Science in Meteorology from San Jose State, California. Prior to working at the observatory, I did aviation meteorology, forensic meteorology, fire science, and a little bit with Homeland Security, mapping how to do toxic explosions in San Francisco. So that was interesting. Some personal extremes I've experienced up on the summit. My highest wind so far has been 171 miles per hour. It's a far cry from the 231, but I'm sticking around until we beat that record. So, and then the coldest temperature I've experienced is 40 below, which is also the same in Fahrenheit or Celsius. So it's easy to remember which one it is. So we did reach 47 below, but unfortunately I was off the summit. And I know a lot of you are thinking, unfortunately, but as a weather geek, so hopefully this little clip will work to kind of give you an idea of some of the weather that we experience up on the summit. So this is the top of the Nelson Crag Trail, but you can see how blowing snow can limit your visibility in addition to having fog up on the summit. And we're in the fog over 60% of the year. So we're not very well with our visibility for most of the year. So hopefully, so some of our daily tasks, this isn't all of them, this is just the truncated version to kind of give you a brief overview, is to take weather observations. So we are going out at least once an hour and taking manual measurements of the weather. So we're going out with a sling psychrometer and measuring things like temperature and wet bulb, taking those in to do relative humidity and dew point. We're also looking what kind of precip is falling. So we use a black, what's called snowboard, not the type that you go downhill with. It's just a black felt on a board. that allows us to catch the flakes to see whether or not it's blowing snow versus falling snow. We're also looking at sky condition when we are clear, and various obscurations that might be inhibiting our visibility up on the summit, and a bunch of other things. And we take all of that data and compress it down into what's called a METAR, and then we're sending that out and disseminating it to the public, so that way they can see it. But that data is also being fed into weather models, and that's also what allows us to look into the future to see what the weather will be doing. So we're one point of thousands around the world that are all feeding into these models to allow us to do our forecasting capabilities. During the wintertime, during most events, we're only going out once an hour to de-ice the instruments, but during more extreme events, we might be going out 2, 3, sometimes upwards of 5 times per hour when we have rime ice, which is basically frozen fog, growing on the instruments, which causes the instruments to not behave correctly. So we're going out there with mallets and crowbars and whatever we can to knock that ice off. And sometimes we have accrual rates of 1 foot an hour. So you're basically knocking off little tiny mini fridges or microwaves off of sides of buildings and instruments to make sure that they're working properly. During the summer, we don't have nearly as much icing events, so that allows us to give tours to the public. As Drew was mentioning, if you guys are ever up on the summit, we do provide tours of our facility. Most people take tours for 1 of 3 reasons. First being the tower, the second being the cat, and the third being weather. So, and then forecasting twice a day. So we put out a higher summits forecast at 5 a.m. and 5 p.m. that is produced in-house, specifically for the higher summits of the White Mountains to give hikers an idea of what to expect over the next 48 hours. Now, the various elements that are involved within our forecasting are kind of broken down into various segments. So the very top section will be any advisories, warnings, or alerts either produced by Mount Washington Observatory in-house, National Weather Service, or the U.S. Forest Service, who is in charge of the Mount Washington avalanche forecast. And they'll sometimes produce a avalanche warning or something of that effect. So we want to make people aware of the inherent risks that they might be encountering, like the bolded type stuff. That way they're aware that frostbite might be dangerous that kind of day. The next is the synoptic section, which is kind of the what and why of how the weather is performing. So if you think of a microscope, we're thinking of a wide angle first. So we're looking at North America, and then we're focusing in on the Northeast, and then we focus in on the New Hampshire, and then the White Mountains, and then we focus all the way down to the summits to kind of get an idea of big picture, what's causing the weather and what's driving it, and then focusing on what the weather will be at our specific location. Now, the bottom sections are 4 12-hour periods, which are broken down into the amount of obscuration or sky cover that we might be encountering. So in the clouds, in and out of the clouds, in the clear, under mostly cloudy skies, and so on and so forth. We're also going to explain what kind of precipitation might be occurring, the temperatures, and then most importantly, winds, because those can not only knock you off your feet, but also can cause damage if you have really cold temperatures in combination with that. Hence the wind chill warnings and advisories that we put out. We don't typically report wind chills in our forecast until it reaches about 35 degrees, which is close to freezing, because that's when you start getting things like hypothermia. It's not to say you can't get hypothermia in temperatures that are 40 and 50 degrees. It's just less common for most people. And once it gets down to about 30 below, that's when we issue advisories. And once it gets to about 50 below, that's when we issue warnings. And 2 years ago, when we hit 47 below, we had 100-mile-per-hour winds, and our wind chill got down to about 106, 108, which would have been instantaneous frostbite if we had any exposed skin. So we were checking each other, making sure that we were all covered. And if we were alone, we were using mirrors to make sure we didn't even have like a little tiny patch of skin exposed. Now, all that element is getting fed out to the public, but also to industries and forecasters for such things as like the avalanches. So like I was saying, the U.S. Forest Service is in charge of the avalanche forecast, and they're looking at our weather elements, but they're also looking at things within the ravines themselves. So the steepness of the slopes. So anything over 30% is avalanche prone. If you've ever skied the Whites, a lot of people like to do the eastern snowfields. That area can slide and just slid 2 weeks ago. So if you think that's a safe area, just be aware it can slide and has slid. Some other causes for avalanches that they're on the lookout for are winter sports. Equipment, so like snow machines, those can trigger things, or if you have a roadway above a steep pitch, that can cause avalanches. Earthquakes, less common out here, but as you all know, one occurred a few weeks ago. So those can trigger avalanches if you have the right kind of conditions, and explosives. Some areas do controlled avalanches. We don't do that out here, but out west, you might be aware they do that. Some other factors that you see there are cornice falls, rock falls, and other types of avalanches that might trigger other avalanches downslope. And then, of course, the weather plays a huge role in that. So they're looking at how much snow we're expecting, what kind of wind speeds we're expecting, what wind direction is it going to be shifting? Because if you have all this snow that's piling on north to south, and all of a sudden you have a shift to east-west, all that snow is going to be then blown over to the east-west sides of the mountain because you basically had a bunch of loading and then it's perpendicular and just pushing that snow that way. And they're also looking at types of precip because that's going to cause different stratification within the snow that will cause weaknesses or liquefaction, and then rain on snow because that can also cause slides not only with wet snow but also later on as that snow freezes over. So one thing, we recently did a study on rain on snow events. This is over the last 40 years. What we have found is that we're seeing more rain on snow events over time. Typically, January and February have gone fairly unchanged, but as you see, as we head out towards the shoulder seasons of spring and fall, we're seeing a lot more rain on snow events. So unfortunately, that means our snow season is typically starting later and ending sooner, and we're not out of the norm there. Most other locations around the United States are also seeing the same trends where their seasons are getting shorter with a lot more rain events penetrating into the shoulder seasons. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ty now, so that way he can talk about his.
It's so nice to be with you tonight, to be here to support the Blue Hill Observatory and the Mount Washington Observatory, and to talk with you about the lines of winter. But I also wanted to say what a pleasure it is to be sharing the stage with Ryan tonight. Ryan and I have a history that goes back to probably 2016, when I started my first book, Where You'll Find Me. And Ryan was the first meteorologist at the observatory that I ever got to meet. And maybe we'll get to talk a little bit more about that tonight in the Q&A section at the end. But just a really quick story. In January 2019, I was leading an overnight edu-trip on the summit in the winter. And I decided that I was in the midst of writing The Last Traverse, the second book. And I decided that I was going to stay up all night long and work on the chapter where they're building the higher summits forecast for that particular story. And Ryan was working that night. And I can just remember numerous times hearing him going out onto the tower, banging the rime ice off of the instrumentation. And I would walk by the observer room quite slowly, hoping that maybe he'd say, "Hey, Ty, come on in." But there was no eye contact because I think Ryan wants to see the cat. He does not want to spend time talking with me. So, but again, it's just a real pleasure. So tonight I'm going to be talking about the lines of winter, and it's my third book. And this really takes place back in January 1982. And as a matter of fact, just 2 weeks ago or so, on January 25th, it was the 43rd anniversary of this tragic avalanche that claimed the life of Mountain Rescue Service team member Albert Dow, and also trapped and injured his teammate Michael Hartrick. And so right off the bat, I don't like gotcha moments, and I just want to take a moment to show a slide when it does come back up. This is good. It's okay.
Sorry about
It's cool. It's all good. And so tonight I'm going to be taking you through the story, and I know that there's going to be folks in the room that have not read the book yet. I'm going to try to be mindful of that, but I don't generally write with spoilers. And this is a photograph of Michael and Albert, and I really always want to emphasize Albert's sacrifice had such a significant impact on search and rescue, the Mount Washington Valley, his family, his loved ones. But I never want us to forget about Michael. his teammate who was with him, who was injured. May his name never be forgotten through all of this, because not only was he a victim, he's a survivor. And I just want to acknowledge Michael today, because I am going to be talking a lot about Albert, but always like to start with that. This is a photograph of Albert and his two sisters, Carol in the middle and Susan. And I spent a lot of time talking with Carol and Susan about Albert's life, about their childhood, about their time with their parents living in Center Tuftonboro. Their parents owned an antique shop. And it was really the hub of that very small village. And one of the things that I was just so struck by in talking with them, and then talking with others who were friends and family members of the Dow family, is it was very clear to me the values that were instilled in these three kids had a huge impact on Albert's decision to be out there selflessly searching for two missing ice climbers. To a person that I would talk to, Albert was the kindest person. He was an excellent friend. He always made you feel as though when he was with you, that you were the most important thing to him. And we can, when we lose somebody, we can elevate them onto this pedestal and not and focus on the positive. But I'm telling you genuinely that every single person I came into contact with, who came into contact with Albert or his sisters, would say this was a family who served others, who were raised to be kind and patient and selfless with everyone. And his sisters have gone on to do that throughout their lives. So this is a photograph of Albert and his niece, Amy. And I show this photograph because on the Friday night before Albert was called out on Sunday night for a Sunday search, he called his niece, Amy, and he sang happy birthday to her in his Kermit voice. This was just a really special relationship that they had. And that's the last time Amy would talk to Albert was on that Friday night 43 years ago. So this is where this story focuses on the eastern side of the Mount Washington and the Presidential Range. And I'm going to be talking tonight specifically about Huntington Ravine, Tuckerman, Alpine Garden, all of these things that we know about, these iconic names, so much history behind all of these places. And also Great Gulf was a really important part of where this story took place. Now, as Ryan talked to you earlier about this increase in rain on snow events, when we talk about and think about accidents in the White Mountains, it's never one event. It's generally a series of events. With anything that goes wrong, you can connect dots backward. And yes, the avalanche that claimed Albert and injured Michael was on January 25th, 1982, which is right in here. But the avalanche itself set up weeks before that. And I think that's one of the main takeaways tonight for those of you that head out into the backcountry, that seek adventure, which I absolutely encourage you to do. But it's just recognizing that these things don't just happen. And so what I want to show you here is on January 4th, there was a thaw-freeze cycle where the temperature went above freezing. There was some precipitation, and then you'll notice that there was this rapid decrease in temperature that froze that thaw cycle solid. And why that is important, because from January 5th through the 23rd, there was this layer of very hard crust all over the range, and in particular on the eastern aspects of the mountain. And this will become very, very critical for what's going to transpire later in the month, where you see 7-8 inches of snow on the 23rd, which I'll talk about, an additional 3 inches of snow on the 24th, and amidst all of these high winds that are transporting the snow. And Ryan and I will be talking to you about that tonight, the dynamics of transport and how that works in the mountains. The other important factor in this story is Hugh Herr and Jeff Batzer. This is a photograph of Hugh up toward the front and Jeff, and they were not only climbing companions, but they were very, very close friends. This is a route down in the gunks of New York. It's called the Kansas City route, done not too long before they made their visit to Mount Washington to do an ice climb of one of the gullies in Huntington. But they had met at a bouldering area in New York a couple of years prior to this. And they would, from that point on, they would go out and they would climb regularly, climb together. And why this is important is not only was this a friendship, but there was this not an arrangement between the two of them, but Hugh at the time, and this was way before social media, way before Facebook, but Hugh was developing a national reputation at 17 years old for his rock climbing prowess. He was putting up incredibly difficult routes in the gunks of New York. He was spending time out west on Yosemite, up in the Canadian Rockies, and that information was getting around. And that will tell you, we think about today, Alex Honnold. Well, Alex can go into a climb, and within minutes of that climb, it's being broadcast throughout the world. That wasn't like this back then, 43 years ago, but Hugh's reputation was growing and growing and growing, and he was getting better and better and better. And one of the reasons that is because Jeff was often his belayer. And Jeff will tell you, even to this day, that going out with Hugh, that Hugh was very comfortable pushing, getting outside of his comfort zone. That's how we get better at things. And that Jeff was oftentimes terrified at what they were doing. And that Hugh would very supportively coach him out of his comfort zone, get him to a place of comfort. And not only was Hugh getting better because Jeff was there, Jeff was getting better and better, and they were taking on bigger and more difficult routes. In January of 1982, Hugh and Jeff decide that they are going to come up to New Hampshire. They lived in Pennsylvania at the time. They were going to come up to New Hampshire, and they were going to climb Pinnacle Gully in Huntington Ravine. It's the classic gully in the Northeast. It's renowned, it's iconic, and they were going to do this. And they had a very long drive out of New Jersey. They had actually gone in the completely opposite direction, and what should have been an 8 or 9 hour ride ended up being about 22 hours in length for them to get here. No GPS, no judgment, right? But they arrived here, and that's important because they had intended to get here earlier on Friday to get up into the ravine to do some reconnaissance for their climb. They didn't get to Pinkham until early evening, and then get to Harvard Cabin. By that time, it was dark, and they weren't going to be able to get out there and go and do reconnaissance for Saturday. They did not sign in at Pinkham Camp, and I'm going to talk about why I think that's important in a moment. But these are the signs that used to be on Route 16 as you would come in either direction. I wish they were still there, but they're not. And we might sit here in judgment of, well, they should have signed in. And what I will tell you in my research, and particularly back then, and it still happens today, I'm confident it happened today, is that people will bypass the sign-in sheet at Pinkham Camp. They will not stop and they will not register. Even the people who were responsible for the sign-in sheet would often not even use the sign-in sheet themselves when they would go. This is a common occurrence. Not saying it's right, but I'm telling you that Jeff and Hugh were not the only ones to ever do this back then, and it still happens to this day. But they arrive at Harvard Cabin. This is a photograph that was taken on that weekend at Harvard Cabin. This is Matt Pierce, the caretaker that particular winter. These are two climbers that had come up from New Jersey along with another gentleman, and they had been spending some time that week climbing in the various gullies. They had done Yale, Odell. They got into a little bit of trouble on Alpine Garden with some very low visibility, but just really this classic photograph of this climber's cabin up in the woods. And when Hugh and Jeff arrived at the cabin, they were already there. There were a couple of other climbing parties there that were intending to go out. Everyone knew the weather was going to be pretty gnarly over the course of that weekend. And there was some tension in the cabin that night because when Hugh and Jeff arrived, Jeff's 20 years old, Hugh's 17, left their wallets down in Jeff's Datsun in the parking lot. And there's a fee that you have to pay. And the caretaker, up until that point, had been dealing with a lot of climbers who were trying to bypass paying the fee, and his level of frustration continued to grow over the course of the winter. Jeff and Hugh arrived, yet another climbing party that's not paying the fee. And so there was a little bit of back and forth about that. And what Jeff and Hugh decided to do is that they would retreat up into the loft and kind of just distance themselves from the situation. But as I had mentioned, there were a number of people there that were planning to climb over that weekend, and everyone was kind of waiting for the 8 o'clock forecast to be broadcast by the observatory. And back in '82, there was no higher summits forecast. The observatory would collect information from the National Weather Service. Ken Rancourt is here. Ken, could you raise your hand, who was an observer for decades and decades? Ken, if I screw any of this up, just stand up, please. But they would take this information from the National Weather Center and out of Gray, Maine, and they would try to determine how it was going to interact, particularly in the Mount Washington Valley, how it would play out. And they would broadcast that out to Harvard Cabin, AMC Pinkham, to the high huts that are open in the wintertime. And this was at 8 o'clock in the morning. So everyone went to bed that night, and everyone huddled around the radio 8 o'clock for their forecast. This group of two and their third companion had already decided Friday night, there is no way we are going out climbing on Saturday, because they had had trouble in even better weather earlier that week. And they just said, you know what, we're going to hang at the cabin for the day. Maybe we'll go do a booze run into Gorham, bring some apricot brandy back for the cabin mates for that night. And that's exactly what they did. So the 8 o'clock radio broadcast comes out. Heavy snow is expected. High wind is expected Saturday through Sunday. It is not going to be a good day. Jeff and Hugh are up early in the morning. They're packing their technical gear. People are just kind of watching like, is this a good idea? Do they really know what they're getting into? And the caretaker is able to work with them toward changing their route from Pinnacle Gully to Odell Gully just to the left. And why this is important is the caretaker felt that given the direction, the shifting winds that were going to take place, that there would be a growing avalanche danger in Pinnacle Gully, a little less so to the left over in Odell. So he was able to get them to change their mind because it would take them less time. They would come down escape hatch, which I'll show you that in another slide or two. And he was feeling pretty good about what was a really subtle intervention, because he can't go so far as to say, yeah, you can't go out and you can't go. They don't have that level of authority. Thankfully, we're able to make our own decisions. There was another party of three that was sitting there listening to the report, and they decide as well, they're going to go. And so Hugh and Jeff depart. They head into the ravine. This party of three heads into the ravine behind them, loses sight of them on this area called the Fan, which is the scree field at the base of these gullies. And they decide, well, we're going to do the gully that Hugh and Jeff decide. We'll pick what they don't go up. And so they elect to do Central Gully. And so their plan is to do Odell. And Central is this area that goes right up the middle. A pretty straightforward climb. There's not a ton of ice in there, particularly in that winter, because it gets loaded with a lot of snow, which hard packs down. And they're going to get after this. And here's why I put this quote up. It's one of my favorites. The dangers of life are infinite, and among them is safety. I believe, and I have a risk management background, I think risk taking is really important. I don't think risk should be avoided, but I think there is a way to manage it and mitigate it and make decisions around it that allow you to get out of your comfort zone, to be uncomfortable, to embrace that discomfort, because that's how we get better. That's how you think about when you first started driving, incredibly novice, very uncomfortable about it. And the more time you spent through instruction, the more confident that you became, because there was a progression through that program, just to use that as one of the most basic examples. So this is what it looks like coming into the ravine. This is not a photograph from that time, but what Jeff will tell you, and Hugh will tell you, is as they were approaching the ravine, there had been this conversation that had taken place on their drive north from Pennsylvania that Jeff really wanted to summit Mount Washington. And he put that out there to Hugh. And Hugh, at that time, was not driven by summits, he was driven by routes. And those are two very different things in the climbing world. And when you combine the two, your risk goes up exponentially, particularly in the White Mountains and on Mount Washington, because that sun disappears to the west behind the northern presidentials quite early, and you don't want to be up there above tree line as it's getting late in the afternoon. But Hugh kind of dismissed it. It was not discussed at that point. It wasn't discussed in the cabin. When they signed out to go into the ravine, they just put Odell Gully down escape hatch. And as they came into the ravine, Jeff is still harboring this desire to go to the summit, but he looks up and sees something very similar to this, which is this low cloud cover, frozen fog, blowing snow, and he and Hugh decide there's no summit today. We're gonna do Odell, we're gonna come down escape hatch, maybe we'll go over to Frankenstein Cliff in Crawford Notch, but it was off the table at that point. And so the one pack that they brought with them that had a bivy sack, a camera, a map, a compass, a little bit of water, and a little bit of food was stashed underneath a rock. Because what they wanted to do is they wanted to hit Odell light and fast. Hugh was concerned about the forecast. He was concerned about growing avalanche risk and knew that if they didn't have the weight of the pack, that they were going to be able to move up that gully more quickly and get back down. Speed equals safety, okay? The key here is to stick with the plan. It was not uncommon back then, and it's not uncommon now for climbers that are going into Huntington to do the route and to descend escape hatch to leave packs and go light. It happened back then, and it still does happen today. This is a photograph that was taken that day from one of the other climbing party, and they're at the base of Central Gully, and you can see here that there's already blowing snow on the ground. Visibility is bad, and no one's really started climbing yet. Jeff and Hugh are on the route, and again, here's Odell. And here's another important factor that I think plays into this, and that is that Jeff and Hugh had come here a year before. So New Year's Eve into New Year's Day, the year before this, they had come up. There was no plan ever whatsoever to go to the summit of Mount Washington. They climbed Pinnacle Gully. They had stashed their pack before, just like they did this year when they're back. They climb Pinnacle Gully without incident. They descend escape hatch. They go over to Frankenstein Cliff and they climb. So there's a very close replication from the year before to what they're going to do now, except that the summit was kind of on the table and now it's been taken off. The pack was stashed the year before. It's being stashed again this year. It worked last year. Why shouldn't it work this time? And this is what we do. We take decisions that we've made in the recent past around things that are familiar to us, and we will take what happened here and we will apply it now without differentiating the two events. Okay, and we're going to talk about those differentiations as we go. But both of these climbing parties, the one of three gets in Central. Hugh and Jeff get onto Odell Gully. They climb quite quickly. They make really good time up through there. Hugh's leading. At one point, Jeff drops his Gore-Tex insulated mitten and it just plummets down the gully. He thinks, damn, but no big deal. I'll just retrieve it when we retrieve our pack after we come back down off of the route. They top out on the route and they're huddled behind the rocks and they're looking out across Alpine Garden and they cannot see the summit. They can't see, there's not a lot of visibility. It's very similar to the video that Ryan showed you. And Hugh puts the summit back on the table. He says, I think we should go for it, okay? And Jeff's immediate reaction, as it always was whenever they would climb together, was, I don't think that's a good idea. And so Hugh starts to, again, carefully support Jeff. No, I think we can do this. I think we can get there. It's a straight line. We'll straight line it up. We'll turn around and we'll come back. I don't think that's a good idea. We can do this. And what Hugh wanted to do is he wanted to honor Jeff because their paths were at this moment in 1982 were beginning to diverge. Hugh was getting better and better on rock. That's what his passion was. Jeff was more drawn to higher peaks, 6, 7, 8,000 meter peaks. He wanted to do big expeditions on big mountains all over the world. And he saw being able to summit Mount Washington in the winter coming out of an alpine gully as another step in that progression toward his goal. And why Hugh put this back on the table is he wanted to honor Jeff for always being there for him and going up these routes that Jeff was terrified to go up, but always being there, belaying him in the event that he fell. And what happens at the top of this gully happens every weekend in the White Mountains. It happens at your houses. It happens where you work. There are 4 things that get us into trouble around decision-making. The first one is we narrowly frame the issue or the decision, okay? It's summit or not. And when we narrowly frame that issue, we then don't consider other alternatives around that decision. So what you saw the year before when they were up here was a wider frame. It was, let's go do a gully, and if we get done early, let's go over to Frankenstein Cliff and climb frozen waterfalls, okay? There wasn't that draw, but we make that decision so narrow that we don't leave ourselves other options. The other thing that we do is around confirmation bias. So when we decide there's something we want or we don't want, every piece of information that is available to us out there to support the decision, we are only going to pay attention to the information that supports what we want or don't want. And so if I'm at the top of the gully and it's not great visibility, but the wind's not blowing hard yet, and I think I know where the summit is, I'm going to create this narrative that supports what I want to do. The third is that decision that we make is based in emotion, okay? It's an emotional decision. There's not a lot of reason or rationality to balance it. Is there emotion around the decision at the top of the gully? What is it? It's their relationship. It's you wanting to say thank you for being there for me as I've gotten better and better and better. And the fourth one is overconfidence bias, okay? And sometimes all of these things can mix, or there might be 2 or 3 in play. But it was, we were here last year, we didn't have a problem, we're climbers, we're comfortable, we know where the summit is even though we can't see the cone, let's go. And what Jeff will tell you is when they made a decision collectively, it was all in. It was all in, let's go. And so they leave the safety and shelter of the gully, and they start to make what they believe is a direct line up toward the summit of Mount Washington. Not long after that, the weather will deteriorate rapidly. The higher up they get, and as Ryan would explain to me as I was doing research, is the higher up you get, the more exposed you are to the wind, the worse the visibility gets because the wind is scuffing the snow off the surface, and the wind is pushing you in a lot of different directions because it's hitting the terrain, it's hitting boulders, it's hitting eddies. Am I doing all right with that? Thank you. All right, just keep me accountable. But yeah, and what happens is they're now kind of getting off track and they're starting to get really concerned. They're screaming at each other. Because it's the only way that they can communicate. It's not anger, it's just they can't hear each other because the wind is blowing so hard. And they huddle and they decide we've got to go back. And so what they decide to do is they make a decision based on what they believe the direction of the wind is. It was directly in our face or similar to there on the way up. Let's turn our backs to it and lead us back down toward Central Gully, which is the gully where the other 3 climbers are topping out by this time. The other 3 climbers top out, they're immediately overtaken by the weather, and they basically have to crawl their way over to the escape hatch to get down off the mountain. Hugh and Jeff start their descent, but it is not in the direction that they believe. They believe that they are heading toward the green X, when in fact what they're doing is heading toward the northeast ridge of Mount Washington, and they arrive at the lip of Great Gulf Wilderness. They think they have arrived at the lip of Huntington Ravine. They start plunging down a snow gully. And they are very, very pleased to think that not only have we found Huntington, we got into the central gully and wow, there's no ice here. And the plunging is awesome. And they're actually making great time. And Jeff is kind of jovial about it. He's like, this is a blast. I'm plunge stepping down this gully. There's no ice bulges. This is great. The further down into the gully that they get, and they start hitting tree line, now Hugh is having concerns that we are not where we are supposed to be. And they keep going and going, and he's not telling Jeff this because Jeff is hugely optimistic that they have found where they need to go. And so as they are reaching lower and lower down, they now know, well, let's start to look for the backpack we stashed. They can't find it. They start moving further into the center of the Gulf. And the further into the center they get, the more vegetation, it just becomes dense. They're having trouble moving. The snow, which was at their shins, moves up to their knee, to their thigh, to their waist, to their chest. Okay? They can't find the pack. Now they're thinking to themselves, maybe we went too far over and we're in Tuckerman Ravine. So let's just keep moving to the center because eventually we'll come out and we'll catch the Tux Trail and we'll head back over to Harvard Cabin. We'll get the pack and everything will be okay. This goes on and on and on. And they're now linked up with a body of water, which is the west branch of the Peabody River that drains out of the Gulf. And they start picking up trailblazes. So they think, okay, this is something, except there's no trail broken out because no one goes in here in the wintertime. It's just was so rare back then for anyone to go there. So they start following the river. They're looking for a place they need to bivouac overnight because it's getting dark. They're getting tired. On 2 occasions, Hugh, who's generally leading, busting through, making a trail and a trough for Jeff, on 2 occasions during water crossings, he falls in, the second time submerging well up toward his thighs. And they have no gear with them. All they have with them now are 2 ice axes each that they brought, a couple of slings. They've left their technical gear on a log because they still think they're in a space where they can go back and get it the next day once they get safe. So they are eventually able to find a bivouac site. And they obviously are not back at the hour that they had anticipated. Concern is growing at the cabin, and Matt decides that he's going to take a couple of climbers from the cabin, go up into Huntington Ravine and look for them, hoping to see headlights descending down Escape Hatch or Odell or somewhere, and finds nothing. So he comes back down to Harvard Cabin, he radios Pinkham Notch, and he alerts them of 2 overdue hikers, gives the information, and then this begins a series of phone calls throughout the Mount Washington Valley as members of Fish and Game, the National Forest Service, Mountain Rescue Service, and AMC staff are alerted that on Sunday that everyone's going to have to get out here and be searching the Cutler River drainage, which is the eastern slopes. So this just gives you, this is a Washburn photo. And this just gives you a sense of how steep the area of the Gulf is and just the vast wilderness that you can't even see here off the picture, but just giving you a sense moving from illustration to photo. So overnight, as snow was falling all day on Saturday night, winds were through Saturday were coming from the south-southwest or south-southeast. They shift westerly overnight. And what happens here is all of the snow that had fallen and was moving north over the course of Saturday is now, as the winds shift west, is going to be moving to the east. I'm going to show this video of Boot Spur. This was taken by the U.S. Forest Service a couple of years ago. And this is what we call a loading event. This is copious amounts of snow bannering off above tree line. And then I'm just going to have Ryan talk a little bit about how that works, a little bit more of the dynamics of how. Ryan, can you give some kind of commentary as to what we're seeing?
Yeah, so as I mentioned earlier, when you have winds that are
basically have piles of snow up on the top of the summit. And as that wind is pushing it off this direction, it's basically treating the mountain like a giant ramp. So all the snow that's coming from the west side of the mountain is flowing over to the east side of the mountain. And as it's coming off the sides of the mountain, it's just blowing up on the top, creating what are called cornices. And then over time, those cornices can create little like wave effects. And then it's only a matter of time until something triggers up. And we can have some really big banner events to the point where if you're driving through Canton on a blue bird type day, it'll look like it's snowing because you just have so much snow slopping off from the top of the summit.
And what this is doing here is it's also settling down on the lower slopes. And so remember that layer of crust that formed in early January of '82. And now what's happening is those winds are moving, shifting to the west. And there's almost now 10 inches of freshly fallen snow that is being moved west to east and onto the eastern slopes of Mount Washington. And so this is a look at the Cutler River drainage, Huntington, Alpine Garden, Raymond Cataract, and the Cutler River drainage encompasses really from the outer rim of the north rim of Huntington up to the summit cone, and then the eastern, probably the eastern, southeastern rim of Tuckerman Ravine. In the wintertime, this is under the jurisdiction of the United States Forest Service and their Snow Ranger program. And this is done under a memorandum of understanding with the state of New Hampshire and New Hampshire Fish and Game. And it's further reinforced by this presidential directive. But basically, because this is such technical terrain and so prone to the avalanche, that Fish and Game delegates authority and oversight of this area in the wintertime to the snow rangers, who are experts in avalanche forecasting, snow science, and snow stability. And then otherwise, in the summertime, Fish and Game then assumes jurisdiction of this area again. And then if there are technical rescues that are required on Huntington Ravine Trail, which can be a frequent area of rescues in the summer, because it's not a trail. It's just not, it's dangerous. But they'll call in like Mountain Rescue Service, who's a technical high-angle team, to augment what happens there. And so they approach this on Sunday. They have an incident command group or search manager group meets at Pinkham, and others are coming in. At 4 o'clock that morning, an AMC employee named Misha Kirk, who's a former Green Beret, he heads up into the ravine because he wants to get up there to see if he can find anything, because if he can save all of these teams from heading out all over the mountain to search, that he wants to do that. He ultimately finds the backpack that has very little in it, and he radios down, and now everyone's even more concerned, given the weather and the dropping temperature, that they're out there, Jeff and you are out there with very, very little gear. And so what they plan to do is they are going to focus on the eastern aspect of the mountain, which is right in here. Fish and Game was going to patrol on snow machines along Tux Trail, Raymond Path. Mountain Rescue Service was shuttled up the Mount Washington Auto Road by Ken Rancourt, who's here. And their plan was to get to the 7-mile mark, where they would then descend and break into 2 teams, because what they had planned to do, they needed to clear Odell Gully, because that was the point last seen of Hugh and Jeff. And they were going to set up snow anchors, and they were going to have a couple of team members rappel from top down, because that is much safer than climbing up with avalanche conditions the way they were. The other team would break off and head across Alpine Garden and meet up with Unit 24, which was heading up the old Lionhead route, and they would rendezvous somewhere on the garden, maximize their line searching capability, because there's a lot of acreage up there. Unit 24 would continue to the rim of Huntington Ravine and do a visual search down the gullies. And then another team of Mountain Rescue Service and Appalachian Mountain Club staff, 23 and 25, would go into the ravine. And what you're seeing here is a focus on the Cutler River drainage. And why? Because they look at past events over time, and they still do this today. They look at wind direction, they look at itinerary, and they are able to say, okay, when the wind is blowing in this direction, climbers will or hikers will get pushed in this direction. People who get into trouble in Odell will either, or any of the gullies in the ravine, will either be found at the bottom of the gully because they fell out or were avalanched out. They'll be found in Alpine Garden because the wind pins them there and they die of hypothermia. Or sometimes climbers will get hung up in the gullies. And that's what happened in 1979 when two caretakers from the Randolph Mountain Club climbed Odell, got hypothermic, got stuck in the gully, and they perished there, and they had to be recovered by the Mountain Rescue Service. So they had a history with this. But you can see where Jeff and Hugh are. And why this is important is that in the history of Mount Washington and climbers in Huntington Ravine, no climbers from Huntington Ravine who had gotten into trouble had ever ended up in Great Gulf before. It had never happened. So there was no reason to look there. And it hasn't happened since. Okay, this is a complete anomaly that they're dealing with. And so all of the focus goes here. This is just a little bit closer up look at what they were trying to do. Again, it's cutoff, it's containment, it's moving in, moving out, and then moving in to try to locate signs of Hugh and Jeff themselves, discarded gear, anything like that, campfires, whatever it might be. This is a photograph that was taken in the back of the Thiokol of three members of Mountain Rescue Service as they're heading up the mountain, Steve Larson, Doug Madera, and Michael Hartrick. And the plan, again, was to get them up to the 7-mile mark for them to descend, but they reached only about the 5-mile mark before they had to get out of the back of the Thiokol, and they were going to continue to walk up to 7 Mile and to try to fulfill their mission. And Ken, I would love it if you could just stand up and maybe share some of your perspective from that transport. I didn't ask him if he would do this, so. But I love Ken, so here we go.
As you can see, there's plenty of snow in the air. Problem is even trying to get up to sea elevation, 4,000, 5,000 feet. You never know where the wind is going to be coming from. Turbulence, the snow is being blown up in this case from the Great Gulf over the auto road and over the northernmost segment, which is the upstate. So it's almost impossible to see. And you find on literally yourself in the van, you can't see the bump.
Thank you, Ken, very much. I owe you. So this is a look at they got up to about the 5-mile post. Ken, very humble, does not talk about the multi-point turn he had to do to get the Thiokol turned around on a narrow roadway to descend back down where he would wait. Mountain Rescue Service was not able to get up to 7 Mile. They were only able to get up toward Cragway. They were unable to, the visibility was awful. They were getting hammered by winds 60, 70 miles an hour. This is an iconic photograph that was taken at the 5-mile post of MRS by David Stone. He has since passed away, but he was a member of MRS. But that just, again, gives you a sense of just how bad the conditions were. So they were not able to clear Odell Gully, which is very important as to how this will play out. They descend the mountain. Other teams were not able to find any sign of Hugh and Jeff other than the backpack. And so they headed back out down for the day, and they were going to come back at this on Monday morning. So on Monday morning, Jeff and Hugh wake up quite early, and they continue to try to make their way down the river because they're hoping that this river is going to take them somewhere toward that they might recognize. Not long after, as you come out of the Gulf, the vegetation thins a little bit. So they're still dealing with deep snow and having to just break trail, but it lightened up and they were able to get there with a little bit more speed. So as search teams are going out on Monday, Jeff and Hugh arrive at the junction of Great Gulf Wilderness and Madison Gulf Trails. And they look at the sign, and first of all, they're weeping with joy because they feel like they finally found something, a trail sign that's going to get them out of there. And they quickly start focusing on the sign. Pinkham Notch, 4 miles, okay? 4 miles. Glen House, 2 miles. Madison Hut, 2.5 miles. They had never heard of the Glen House. They felt that Pinkham, although they were familiar with it, seemed so far away, given what they had just had to go through, but they had heard of Madison Hut before. And so they're not factoring in terrain. They're making decisions purely on distance. They don't know where they are. They've never been in Great Gulf before. They don't realize that if they follow the sign to Pinkham, they're going to hit the 2-mile mark of the auto road. They don't know that. They don't know that if they hiked out to Glen House, at that time, it would hit the old Osgood cutoff trail and would essentially deliver them to the base of the auto road. But they don't know this. And so they decide, based on distance and not knowing, that they're going to go toward what they know, which is Madison Hut, the shortest distance, and a much shorter distance than Pinkham Notch. And this is a fateful decision for them and for those that are looking for them, okay? And so they start to make their way up Madison Gulf. And all I can tell you is that that was more arduous than what they had already dealt with. Now they're climbing in chest-deep snow. And after about probably traveling less than a mile over the course of the day, they decide to turn around. They go back down to the Madison Gulf Junction. They're able to find a large boulder with which to bivouac under with some tree boughs. And they're going to spend Monday night here as well. And so there's Sunday night, and they're going to spend Monday night there as they go. So on Sunday night, before the Monday search, there was one last search of Old Jackson Road. A team of 3 from Appalachian Mountain Club went out to the 2-mile mark from Pinkham Camp. And at that point on Sunday, that was the closest any searchers will have gotten to Jeff and Hugh, within about 2 miles or so from them. But again, they had no idea they were there. Why they sent the team out here as the last search of the day on Sunday is because they were hoping to see that maybe they had mistakenly found the auto road and had made a descent there. So on Monday morning, they're just going to focus the technical teams from Mountain Rescue Service on the gullies. They have to clear Odell because it's the point last seen. And so they send a team up to try to do South Gully. They try, because if Hugh and Jeff had climbed Odell and were trying to descend in emergency, maybe they picked the wrong one. So they're looking everywhere to the left. At that time, they'll also be able to search Escape Hatch. And then they're going to send a team up Odell left and Odell right. And so Joe Lentini and Tiger Burns are assigned to South Gully. And they quickly find themselves in waist-deep snow and wind slab. And Joe Lentini makes a decision. It's too risky for us to do this. We cannot be here. And they will make a descent. And I would just like to note, Tiger Burns passed away about 2 weeks ago. And I just want to acknowledge him tonight. My thoughts are with his family and his teammates. So they descend, and there's a thiocol that's waiting down here because there's still teams that are sweeping the base of the gully. Steve Larson and Doug Madera will climb south Odell Gully left without incident. And when I say without incident, it was pretty much without incident, but I'm going to leave that to those of you who haven't read yet because it's a pretty important anecdote as to the commitment level of these teams. Albert and Michael climb Odell Gully right. And they climb without incident. They reach the top of the ice flow, and they have a decision to make there. Do we rappel back down, or do we continue climbing the snowfield up to Alpine Garden and then descend from there? And when they got to the top of the ice flow, they decided not to rappel because Michael, Albert's teammate, was fearful of rappelling. He did not like to rappel off ice or snow anchors. He was very, very uncomfortable with it. He didn't trust the gear back then to hold. While Doug Madera and Steve Larson were able to find good anchor points. The anchor points were not so good in Odell Wright. And so Albert and Michael decide we're going to continue up Odell Wright. We'll top out at Alpine Garden and we'll get off the mountain. And at this point, all of the teams are now converging at the base of Huntington, waiting for Albert and Michael to complete their climb. And they're going to call it a day because there's just no sign of Hugh and Jeff. As they're ascending the gully, they're starting to pick up footprints, okay, in the boot puncture marks in the snow of people who are ascending there. Michael looks over to the side of the gully and he sees a carabiner that's anchored into the side of the ledge. And this is the first sign that anybody's been there or been around. They go over to the carabiner, they can see a lot of footprints on what was clearly a belay station, and those footprints continue up out of the gully and they elect to follow them. They reach the Alpine Garden. They can see that the tracks continue out across Alpine Garden and they radio down, we've located footprints, we located a carabiner, and we're going to continue across Alpine Garden. And so then the team that had convened here, they decide we're going to move over toward Tuckerman Ravine because Albert and Michael's plan is to descend Lionhead. This is a photograph that was taken during the search. And the reason you can't really tell other than there's two people in that photo is because it was so cold at 40 plus below zero that the film on the camera froze solid. And so this just gives you a sense of the conditions that these teams were operating in at that time. As Albert and Michael are making their way across the garden, the observatory hits a gust of 101 miles an hour. They absolutely would have been exposed to that level of wind as they came out of the shadow of the cone and approached Lionhead Massif. So this is their route out of Odell. They contour Raymond Cataract, which lies in between Huntington and Tuckerman. And when you contour, you're just kind of picking an elevation that's going to deliver you to a lower point if you just continue to follow it. And they avoided the higher parts of Lionhead and Alpine Garden Trail. They come onto the Lionhead summer route. AMC radios to them that Misha Kirk is down below here and sees a lot of wind slab that's built up, which Ryan described to you, and tells them to not take the summer route, which is very prone to avalanche, and to get back on the winter route. And so Michael and Albert continue to move across the face of Lionhead, trying to find the winter route to get back down the mountain. The visibility is terrible. Michael is intimately familiar with this area, but he can't pick out any visual references that he recognizes. They're both looking for the tracks of the team that ascended the day before, but they've been completely covered over by that loading snow that you saw. So they continue to move and continue to move across the face, recognizing that eventually they're going to come to Hermit Lake and the Hermit Lake shelters and the Forest Ranger cabin, and they'll get in there and get warm until they can be picked up. They stop briefly to have something to eat. They're cold, they're exhausted, and as they're approaching Hermit Lake, they're at about 4,000 feet elevation, right in the area where you can see this here. And they can see this clearing out ahead of them. There's a birch glade. What we know now that we did not know back then is that birch glades on slopes represent new growth, which represents that something took down the previous growth. But no one had ever seen any kind of a slide of any nature here before 1982, and no one has seen one there since. As Albert and Michael step out onto this small chute, and Albert is below Michael, Michael is below Albert. Again, they're at about 4,000 feet on a 30 to 35 degree slope, and this large slab avalanche lets go. It's about 40 feet or so above them. It's about 70 feet across and almost 300 feet in length, okay? And that just breaks immediately and knocks them both forward onto their stomachs. And it brings them down into the birch glade. And no surprises here, I just don't, but Albert is he hits something in the snow on the way down, whether it's a tree or a rock or something fallen. It doesn't, there's so much debris in the mountains that he is killed instantly. He suffers a traumatic injury. Michael is somehow able to just keep punching at the snow as it's starting to cover him over down at the bottom of the glade, where he can access his radio, bring it to his mouth, yell avalanche, 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 and punch his arm up through the snow. The thiocall that's full of their teammates is making its way over to this call when they hear Michael screaming on the radio for help. And so immediately they get here and they disperse. And one rescuer finds Michael quickly. It takes some time to dig him out. Several hundred pounds of snow have to be removed from him. And then over the course of an hour, this is the bottom of the glade looking up, they are able to, using avalanche probes, they're able to locate Albert in the snow and remove him. They attempt resuscitation, but it becomes very clear to them that there's absolutely nothing that they can do about this. And so you can imagine the absolute overwhelming grief that these people are feeling at that moment. It's bitterly cold. The wind is blasting them. They've been out searching for hours and hours over the course of 2 days. Not only is he their teammate, but he's a friend. Very, very close-knit group of individuals within search and rescue community in New Hampshire that continues today. And most of these people standing there dealing with this are in their early 20s. They've never encountered loss before. This is an overwhelming traumatic incident. And they have to now put their teammate in a litter. And I want you to think about, it was always somebody else. It was always somebody else that they didn't know covered up that was put in the litter. And this is a friend and a teammate. And there are no critical incident stress debriefing services for them back then, as there are today. They can only bury this. They have to just keep it in and not deal with it. And that's exactly what most of them did, is they just didn't talk about it. But that is one of the things that has changed out of this. And amidst all of this, in bringing Albert down, notifying family members, Hugh and Jeff are still missing. The search has to continue. Okay, imagine that, the complexity of that, the contrast of it. And so what they decide to do is that the technical teams and the ground teams have done all that they can do. They are going to remain on standby, on call for Tuesday, and that they're going to start a search by air on Tuesday afternoon. That's exactly what they do with a Huey and a crew from the New Hampshire Army National Guard. This is a photograph that Misha, who was on the helicopter assisting, took as they were approaching Huntington Ravine. And not long after this photo was taken, the aircraft hits turbulence and is almost pulled into the north wall of the ravine. And I'll leave that for you to read about some of what that was like for them. But that search goes over the course of Tuesday. You can see how angry the mountain is. It's exactly as Ryan would describe. It's a bluebird day, but it looks like it's snowing on the mountain. Okay, and that's because the winds are still very, very high. Hugh and Jeff can remember seeing the helicopter flying over, but they thought it wasn't for them. They just never made the connection that there might be an air search. And while this is all taking place, another thing is happening here. Two backpackers who had arrived on Saturday are making their way across Old Jackson Road toward Great Gulf, because they're going to go into Great Gulf, go up the Madison Gulf Trail into Madison Gulf, and hope to do a northern presidential traverse. Cam Bradshaw, who's an AMC employee, leaves camp on Tuesday morning just to get out of there, because the mountain's been kind of shut down so that they don't get false positives from the air search. And she's now making her way across Old Jackson, crosses the auto road at the 2 mile mark, and encounters the two backpackers. Okay. They just briefly say hello to each other. Cam continues on, and not long after that, she'll see these prints in the snow. And at first she thinks it's a moose. And what she's actually looking at is that Jeff Batzer had made another attempt to try to reach the Glen House or Pinkham the next day, the day before this. And what she's seeing here is evidence of him doing that. It's just she doesn't know it. So she follows these into Great Gulf, follows the tracks up to Madison Gulf where Hugh and Jeff attempted to get to the hut, expects now maybe these are the climbers. I'm probably going to find them dead at the end of these tracks. They're not there. She descends back to the junction and spends a brief time there, and Jeff sees her and he calls out to her. And she can't believe what she's seeing. And she goes to them, climbs down a very steep embankment, gives them some food and a little bit of clothing, tells them, I'm going to go out to try to alert people that you probably won't see rescuers for 5 or 6 more hours. And at this point, Hugh is completely incapacitated from frostbite. Jeff is partially incapacitated from frostbite. But they feel that they're going to be saved at that point. And that's exactly what happens because the backpackers arrive there. They start treating them. The Huey helicopter is alerted. They drop Misha Kirk and a crew chief in Great Gulf, get them packaged up, and essentially are able to get them to Littleton Hospital, which was at the time nationally renowned as the place go-to for hypothermia and frostbite treatment. They would often get calls from all over the country and the Himalayas in terms of how do we treat frostbite and hypothermia. But you can see the distance between Pinkham and the bivouac site. Jeff was taken up first. They were able to get him across the span bridge and over to this small knoll. Hugh, they actually had to put in a litter and bring him out onto the frozen riverbed because they just didn't have enough people out there to carry him across. And so as we come to a close, this is a photograph of Hugh Herr, who has become internationally renowned in the area of prosthetic development. This is a photograph of Jeff, who returned to the site of their 2 nights of bivouac in early 2000. That just gives you a sense of where they spent 2 nights lying on pine boughs and covered by them. And Jeff would go on from this and he would devote his life to God. He was a spiritual, religious person before this, had been drifting away from it a little bit because he was so obsessed with climbing, but he redevoted himself to God, and he would spend the next 10 years out speaking to congregations about how he had been saved, how God had sent rescuers to him. He would do multiple international relief missions all across the world because they vowed in their hospital room as they lied next to each other when they learned of Albert's death that they would go on to do good in his memory, that they would make something of all of these selfless people that came out to look for them to try to help them. Since that time, there's been major changes as a result of Albert's death. Volunteer search and rescue teams in New Hampshire did not have workers' comp coverage. The legislature passed a bill almost immediately after Albert's death to cover these volunteers when they are going out and operating under the oversight of New Hampshire Fish and Game. There's also federal workers' comp when they're operating under the oversight of the National Forest Service. There's a rescue cache in Huntington Ravine that's been dedicated to him. And the extreme weather exhibit up at the summit at the Mount Washington Observatory in the State Park building, the museum, the extreme weather exhibit is dedicated to Albert's memory. And I just want to leave you with this quote by Joe Lentini, who was a very, very dear friend of Albert's and a teammate. And Joe was incredibly angry at Hugh and Jeff, was one of, as you can imagine, there was a lot of anger amidst the grief. And Joe, he came to accept what happened. He came to know Hugh. Hugh moved from Pennsylvania into North Conway to confront what had happened and ended up befriending and climbing with the very people who were out there looking for him. But this is also just an incredible story of forgiveness. The Dow family has forgiven. They are now friends and communicate regularly with Hugh and with Jeff. Members of the search and rescue teams who were there see Hugh, know Hugh, and just really admire what they have gone out on to do. So Albert's sacrifice really had such a huge lasting impact on search and rescue in the White Mountains of New Hampshire that continues on today. So I'd just like to thank you. We're going to move to Q&A. Before we do that, I just want to again recognize Mount Washington Observatory in Blue Hills. If you are a member of either or both, thank you so much. If you're not, please consider joining, because that higher summits forecast that we all use toward mountain safety, it does not sit behind a paywall. That is created by people like Ryan, and it's accessible to us. And one of the greatest ways you can support their work is to join as a member or to consider a gift. So thank you for being here. And at this point, thank you. I'm going to turn this over to Tim Kelly, who you might recognize from NECN. You may have seen him there, meteorologist, and he is going to facilitate the question and answer period. Tim.
That was amazing.
Thanks.
Oh my God, it's like you were there.
Oh,
How did you
thanks.
do that?
Thank you. Nice to meet
man.
you.
Nice to meet you. We've never met. I have hiked the ravines and I've spent nights up there before, and I'm sure most of us are having a tough time breathing right now. Even though that was, let's see, 82, 92, 2002, it's over 35 years, and you act like you were there. So you must have just talked to everybody, everywhere.
Yeah, talked to a lot of people.
And I missed the beginning. Did you have an experience of your own?
On a different ridge in the White Mountains, I did, but I didn't share it tonight.
It's in the book.
It's in the first book.
And was it a near-death encounter for you?
It was my ego got away from me, and I suffered a little bit, but I got down. But I learned a ton from it. So yeah.
I have spent a couple nights in the Hermit Lake huts in the wintertime, and I have skied Tuckerman Ravine, and it was the most frightened I've ever been in my life. Going climbing with my friends. Oh, this shouldn't be much of a problem, and you're doing pretty well at the left gully, and then you come to the corners, and that last 15 feet of hiking up the corners with skis over your shoulder, which is not the way to do it. Your legs start going like this. Everyone's familiar with what they call sewing machine leg. And then you just have to send rhythm down through your body of calming yourself down, saying, this is no way, you're not going to make it if you don't calm down. And so many people, like you said, are going to experience that, where we have to make some really critical decisions right here. So I talked forever about the whole weather and everything. Ryan and I have been friends, I don't know if you all saw talking earlier on the internet for a long time, but I just met Ryan today for a time. And I'm part of the Blue Hill Observatory for a long time throughout. Anyhow, we're going to take some Q&A. And am I supposed to carry a mic around? I can know. Very good. So a Q&A. People down front want to raise their hands first. That would probably be easier. I can work my way up this very well groomed stairway. Thank you, Charlie, for all your service all these years. Reserved. No questions? I've got a million questions. All right, I'm going to come over there. Here, I'll just hand you the mic. Excuse me. Introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Gail Pells from West Haven, Connecticut. And Ty, just fantastic book. My husband and I have read both of them. We want to go buy the third. But you wrote in The Lions of Winter that there were about 1,000 man hours that were spent in the rescue. Did you figure out what the cost, even given the fact that there were so many volunteer positions, what that would be maybe in 1982 dollars?
I saw a figure, but it was purely for fish and game overtime. It was not, they didn't do a calculation for that. I mean, if that happened today, you're over $100,000, I think, given the number of people. Exactly. Yeah. Yep.
Hi, my name is Eileen Fabish. I'm from North Attleboro, and it's actually for Ryan, and it's not in relation to the book at all. How do you get back and forth? How do you commute to your position? How does your car, how do you use the car? I don't understand.
Yeah, so in the summertime, we use a truck and van. So if you were part of the VIP party, that van that you drove in is one of our vehicles that goes to the summit. So we work 8 days on and then we get 6 days off. So we're actually living on the summit for 8 days at a time. So we go up once and then come down once. So our commute is only once a week. Several people actually live pretty far away from the base of the summit. So we have some people that actually live down here in Massachusetts. But bear in mind, their commute is only once a week. During the transition season, we are using 4x4 vehicles with chains on all 4 tires. Some of them are double chained, so that way we have a little bit extra traction. That will either get us all the way to the summit or we'll park our snow tractor about halfway. By snow tractor, what I'm talking about is if you've ever gone skiing, you may have seen a groomer that smooths out the trails. We have a modified version of one of those that has a cabin on the back of it that could fit about 11 people and supplies and whatnot. And so we'll drive up halfway up the mountain, transfer everything over to that vehicle, and then take the rest of the way up in that. And then once we have enough snow on the road, we'll take that all the way to the base and then take that all the way to the summit. It is a very, very slow and very nauseating machine. I hate it. And I always say it's kind of like owning a boat. The 2 best days are when you buy it and when you sell it. The 2 best days are when you first ride it and then the last day you ride it. I relate it to like a ship on the teacup ride at Disneyland. It turns on a dime, as Ken was saying. If you have to turn around, it can turn basically on a road width and just turn around. But you're also going back and forth trying to smooth out the road. We're not going all the way down to the pavement. We're just smoothing it out so that way we're level, because anytime it has a pitch, you're prone to going sideways. And so we're just trying to make it so that way it's level. And there's sections of the road that have birch poles along it that are about 10 feet tall. And in really good winters, those are getting buried. So we have to dig those out so that way we know where the edge of the road is, and we'll be floating on about 10 feet of snow. So if you're prone to height fears, that's not good either.
Hi, my name is David McPherson. I live on Cape Cod. And Ty, I've read all 3 of your books, and each one is fabulous. And they influence when I go hiking, how I think about it. My question is, when you started working on the book, how did the people, the subjects in the book, feel about somebody reaching out 40 years after the fact? I imagine there were a lot of painful memories involved for that. And I wonder how the response you received.
So thank you for your question. I love the Cape, by the way. It's a really good question. And I use the term progression in the beginning about how we approach risk and get better at things. And Lions was not a book I could have ever started with. To have the rescuers share what they shared and to be as vulnerable as they were with me. So it took time. I wrote one, and then you write one and they're more comfortable as they read it. And then I moved to The Last Traverse and found the conversations just continued to expand. So when I got ready to do Lions, many of those people the first book took place in 2015. Some of the people in the 2015 search were in the 1982 search, and some of them are still out there doing it today. That just gives you a sense of how long they've been doing it. So I think, again, it was a progression for me in terms of trust with them and their comfort level in talking. I'm so grateful to them for sharing what they did.
I've never met Ken Rancourt, but I've been reading about you for my whole life. Were you up there in February 1969 by any chance? You're not. Okay. 1969. It's on the radar right now. I'll tell you why in a minute.
Ty, first of all, just thank you. One common theme that struck me very deeply in all your books is this whole notion of decision traps. And once you're in one, it sounds like a rabbit hole that's very hard to crawl back out of. Can you talk a little bit about that, about how you climb back out of those decision traps?
Yeah, so thank you for the question. If we think about narrow framing, it's when we arrive at something, a decision, I think we have to ask ourselves, let's use the mountain as an example, summit or descend. You have to expand that. Well, maybe we don't summit, but if we descend, maybe we could go do a different trail or a different gully, or why don't, if it's about spending time together, maybe we go and have a longer lunch. That's just an example. Confirmation bias. It looks like things are going really well, and I'm telling myself things are great. I might be telling myself things aren't good, and I'm actually missing out on a great opportunity because of the narrative. It can go either way. So it's asking myself, am I really locked into this position I'm in? Where might I find information that conflicts with what I believe? And I need to spend time with it. Emotion, we all know, we all make decisions based on emotion. And I think it's kind of that when we find ourselves going from 0 to 100 or really excited about something or concerned, it's spending time with that, saying, why am I feeling this way? Can I bring some rational thought to this decision? And then the last one I mentioned was overconfidence. And that's when we overestimate our ability and we underestimate the situation that we're heading into. And that can be in a car, it can be climbing a ladder, it can be in a classroom, it can be at 4,000 feet. So yeah, just those are some tips. I make really bad decisions quite often, so I'm not going to sit here and say I don't. And my wife's here, so she can attest to that.
Ben Weatherall, I'm from Boston. Thank you, that was great. I was just up in Bartlett on Friday, and I read in the local paper that there was a pretty heroic rescue last Sunday on Jewel Trail. How often do these really heroic, and this was in the nighttime, all night long in the winter. How often do these really heroic rescues happen?
I think I was with members of MRS yesterday who were talking about that incident, and they would kind of withdraw with the word hero. They don't feel, they feel there's a perception that they're out there over the edge, and they're not. They're operating within their technical capability and expertise in an environment that is native to them. Sometimes they get close to the edge, but they know where that edge is, and they're very careful about crossing over it. And a lot of that has to do with what happened 40 years ago. But what happened on Jewel Trail the other night was a true save by search and rescue, because if they hadn't gotten there, they would not have survived that. They were hypothermic. They were in deep, deep snow. They would not have lived the night, even though they were prepared, but they had been overtaken by cold and snow. So rescue doesn't happen with the frequency that I think we think it does. We believe it happens all the time because of the 24-hour news cycle, but the call out level over the years has stayed pretty consistent. They're not really seeing an increase in call out searches. But that was a special event because of SAR the other night. That was a true save.
Thank you, Lori, and I actually volunteered. So I was up at the top with Ryan for a week, 2023, I think I was up there. So quick question, and that actually, it piggybacks on what you were just saying. With social media, good or bad, whatever it is, there seems to be an explosion in extreme hiking, gridding, etc. So I was interested to see if there was an increase in rescue need or staffing needs to meet that. I know that they thought about, they do charge people now sometimes when they need to be rescued, but you just indicated that they haven't seen an increase.
The teams, by and large, are seeing an increase in recruitment and retention. People are really drawn to the volunteerism. Could I? Yep. So whether there seems to be an increase in backcountry recreation toward the extreme, and are they seeing increases in call outs for that? I think where the concern lies is that backcountry skiing is really taking off. Backcountry travel, you have pretty hardcore hikers who are trying to avoid crowds because you're seeing more and more people in all 4 seasons. And so people are venturing out into more remote areas where there's a lot of 30, 35 degree slope and a lot of snow. And so there is concern, particularly about that happening. Fortunately, it's not that hundreds of thousands of people go into the White Mountains every year, and a majority of them come out fine. We focus on the one the other night. We focus on the one 2 weeks ago. But by and large, most people come out. Sometimes with bruised egos, fractured ankles, broken wrists, but for the most part, for the number of people that go into the mountains here, the call outs could be much, much higher than they actually are.
Hi, I'm Charlotte Markey. I'm from Richmond, Rhode Island. And thank you, Ty. Thank you, Ryan. I just want to say that I enjoyed your first 2 books, and I can't wait to read Lions. And I know it's probably too early about asking you what's next, but do you think that your concentration is always going to be with search and rescue in the White Mountains?
Okay. The first thing you thanked Ryan and I just want to take a moment. I really appreciate the kind feedback I'm getting. I could not tell these stories without search and rescue extending access, family members of survivors themselves, and the Mount Washington Observatory. I mean, there are multiple characters in these stories. Yes, there's the human side of it, but the mountain itself is a character, and the weather is as well. And I couldn't bring that to life without Ryan and the other members of the observatory team sharing with me decades and decades of weather data that they've collected 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, and the willingness to sit with me and explain it to me. So what's next? I am doing some research. I am working with the observatory again. Will I stay in this particular focus area? I don't know. I'm very passionate about these stories, so I'm staying where I'm passionate right now.
Anybody? Okay. I apologize, Ken. 1969, we were just in diapers.
Hi, this is for both people on the stage, Ryan and Ty. I'm just curious because some of this, obviously there's been huge technological changes in both communications, and I'm thinking of these poor people out, the people out all night. But some of it still seems very low tech, like out there banging away on the Rime ice. I'm just curious if you can comment on the difference in technology, both for people out enjoying the wilderness and people doing the rescues between that time and now.
I guess I'll speak to weather instrumentation first. Surprisingly, yes, things have advanced, but they haven't advanced to the point where they operate successfully on a mountaintop such as ours. We are getting better at remote technologies, which is allowing us to put stations where we never thought we could. There's actually a partnership that we had that allowed us to put a station up on Mount Everest. They don't see as much Rime ice as we do, and their wind direction is pretty consistent. So we were able to modify our instrumentation to accept that. But what we have found is the old technology is the best technology. As far as modern technology as it relates to rescues, a lot of people think their phone is their savior. Please stop that. It is not. In the White Mountains, our cell coverage is very spotty. Where these individuals got lost, their cell phone would have been a brick. The Great Gulf has 0 cell service. And so when you are down in that gully, they probably would not have been able to signal anybody. They may have had success with the Apple technology that's allowing people to connect to satellites. The problem is people never stop moving. And we've had a few rescues in my time there where somebody signaled either a Garmin or an iPhone, and then we go to where their last location was and they're not there. And you think, oh, you just moved down the trail. But as you saw with these individuals, they weren't even on a trail. And so you run into the problem of, okay, here's where they last were. Where do I think they went? And as Ty was talking about, we do have like procedures as to, okay, the winds are coming from this direction. They should be in this cone of uncertainty, but you never know. They might have backtracked or they might have been in an eddy of some sort and caused them to divert to another location. So technology can assist you, but you should never think of it as your savior, basically.
All right, I just got the tap signal from the Charlie up there with his watch that we're a little over. And as for the 1968-69 winter, the holy grail of winters in the White Mountains is 1968 and 69. And of course, none of us were born at that point. But once in a lifetime weather happens to somebody somewhere on Earth every day, as do these kind of incidents. And we are now within about the top 5 winters compared to 1968-69. I go by the Mount Mansfield snow stake. There's only a few winters that have had more snow up to this point. I know we couldn't ever tell that at the Blue Hill Observatory in Boston, but it's an incredible winter that's ongoing right now. And the next 2 weeks, man, your EMS. Thank you so much, Ty. It's great to meet you. Thank you, Ryan. Thank you all for coming. Let's do it again next week.